I'm John Buchanan. Now, what is it about the word loop that immediately just gives the impression of something playing endlessly and predictably? The thing about most loops is that that is exactly what they do. They start and they stop, but effectively what they do is they provide this kind of endless cyclical endlessness. An endless cyclical endlessness. There we are, I've said it now. Let's just go with that for a moment. What we're going to do within this video is to see whether or not we can take the concept of a loop, but create something interesting, polyrhythmic, syncopated, and just a bit other. And we're going to use live loops to do it. And we're going to build a live loop session from scratch, which I don't think is something we've ever done before. So here's how that's going to be done. What I'm going to do is to start with a brand new live loops project, which I've just selected from the Logic Pro menu. And what I'm then going to do is to set up the instrument, which is going to kind of provide the foundation at the heart of what I think this project is going to be, which is going to be a little bass line. And this is going to be a loop, just like a regular loop. So in other words, what I'm going to do is to just come and find a synth bass sound. Punchy electro is where I'm going, I think. And what I'm then going to do is to create just a regular loop. Now, there are a number of ways that I can do this within Logic. Firstly, within a live loop session, effectively, just like a regular Logic project, this is my tracks area. So if I just play some notes, I can hear the sound that I'm working with. But what I effectively need to do is to make a loop to go in this first slot. And I can do that in a number of ways. So I can control click to create a MIDI cell or a pattern cell, which is going to give me just a pattern sequencer to add notes to if I want to. Or of course, I can just record into this cell using a click track and just making a recording in a regular way. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create a MIDI cell. So what this is going to do is just to provide me with a MIDI pattern, which when I double click it is going to open up the piano roll display at the bottom. And what I'm here going to do is just to select the keynote for my project. I think if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm going to go with C. So what I want to do here is just to provide myself with a little bit of a pattern, maybe not that C. Turns out it was broke. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just create a little pattern which looks like this. Now, because this instrument from Retro Synth is using velocity to control the filter, rather than just 3 lots of notes or a pattern of 3 notes that are using exactly the same velocity, what I'm going to do is just to dive into here and I'm going to just create a little bit of shape on these notes so that the first note is nice and loud, and then effectively what I'm going to do is just to back away from that point so that we get this kind of shape and we get a little bit of velocity happening here. Now then, here is our first loop within live loops, except that I have programmed a pattern which only occupies the first bar of that 4-bar cell. And this is where we're going to spend a lot of time today, this idea of how long do we want each of our loops to be. Effectively, I want this pattern just to play over and over and over again. In other words, it can just be a bar long if I want it to be. And the place where I can edit it is up here in the top left-hand corner. How long do I want the cell length to be? Well, I don't need it to be 4 bars. I need it to be 1 bar, and by adjusting the cell length, the loop length is going to change too. I can't loop over bars that I'm not using. So effectively what I've now got is a 1-bar loop for my project, which sounds like this. And if I want to adjust the sound within Retro Synth, of course, I can just open it, maybe take off a little bit of the filter envelope. Okay, and there we are. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, where are you going with this? Because of course, to do that just in a regular Logic project would be really straightforward. Okay, well, we're getting there, I promise. What I want to do next is to effectively say, okay, well, this is going to be my first cell. This is where my project is going to start with this little 1-bar loop. But what I want to do is to basically make it available to more sophisticated versions of what this loop is going to be as well. So what I'm going to do is to just copy it sideways into these cells. Now, if you're brand new to live loops, effectively what I can do within live loops is to trigger a vertical stack of cells by clicking these buttons down here. Now, at the moment, I only have 1 cell, 1 track, so it doesn't matter which one of these I select, they're all going to trigger the same thing. In order for there to be variation, what I need to do is to set up another cell. This time what I'm going to do is to choose an audio track. I'm going to hit create, I get a brand new track, and what I'm interested in doing is coming to the live loop section. I'm going to come into the beats area, and what I'm then going to do is to filter via this word topper, which effectively provides me with kind of high-end hi-hats, percussion, little collections of sounds that are up at the top end of the frequency area. And I haven't selected one, so we're now going to spend 15 minutes here. You can go make a tea if you like, while I find something that I might want to use. Let's have a listen. Bargain bin topper. Going to avoid that. No. No. Okay, we're going to be a little bit more specific here for a moment. What I'm going to do is to come into the, I think, electro house section. Let's have a listen to this. See, sometimes it doesn't take that long. What I'm going to do is to drag and drop this into the second cell. So effectively, this second cell is going to be my first variation. Okay, now by default, this loop is 8 bars long. Okay, but I bet it's the same thing, more or less 8 times. Now, what starts to happen, which is potentially a bit more interesting from a polyrhythmic perspective, or indeed a rolly-rhythmic perspective, which is what I said a moment ago, is what happens when we start adjusting loop lengths, not just in bars, but in divisions of a bar as well. Okay, so we've already established that if I was to take the cell length down to just a bar, that's going to adjust the loop length, fine. What I'm actually going to do is to take the cell length down to not just 2 bars, but maybe 1.5 bars. So effectively what this is now going to do, and I think we'll see that reflected in the waveform here as well, is that effectively I'm going to get the whole of bar 1 and then I'm going to get half of bar 2 before bar 1 starts again. So rather than the regularity of a 2-bar loop, effectively the little moments within this loop are now going to come round every 6 crotch hit beats. That sounds like this. Well, that's a bit more interesting. Okay, so it looks up here like the only options we have for both loop length and cell length are bars and whole beats, right? So I've got, in other words, a whole bar and then 3 separate beats. But actually, I can get a bit more involved than that. So if I wanted to add, let's say, an extra couple of 16th notes to this loop, what I would need to do would be to say, okay, well, I want the loop to be 1 bar long, 3 beats long, and let's say 3 extra 16th notes as well. In other words, a 3rd line of data. And what I'm going to do is to just dial that in, and effectively what happens now is I can see that the loop length has changed. Which means that because it's only missing 1/16th note, it's going to take, I need some maths here, 15 bars before it starts again in the same place that the first loop does. Okay, so really every time that plays around, there is a different relationship between the bass line and this loop. Okay, well that's interesting, particularly if what we then do is to find another loop which also uses a different offset. Let's do that again with another MIDI region. This time what I'm going to do is to come and find another synth part. So again, I'm going to use Retro Synth. This time I'm going to come and find another preset just to make life really easy. I'm going to use one of our old friends, a little plucky sound called Airy Picks. The only problem with this sound is it's got a 3.5 second release time right out of the box, which is generous, too generous. So what I'm going to do here is just to adjust that a little bit. But what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to create another MIDI cell. And this time what I'm going to do is to almost treat this like it is a pattern sequence. So even though I'm using a regular MIDI cell, what I'm going to do is to remember that we are in C. And what I'm going to do is to just pretty randomly, just kind of without thinking too carefully, create a little sequence here. And every once in a while I'm going to make the notes that I use a chord, but often it will just be one note by itself. So it's the old chatting whilst drawing approach, which is always kind of interesting. So I'm sort of being careful, but I'm also sort of not. And let's just see where this takes us. Now, in a minute, I'm going to be adjusting the length of this region anyway, so I'm kind of being a bit random about this. but I'm going to just keep going, and I reckon 2 bars will do us. Okay, especially bearing in mind, you know that I'm about to adjust the length of this. Okay, well, just out of the box, if this were 4 bars long, admittedly we're only going to get 1 note on bar 3 and then there'll be 2 bars of silence, but that sounds like this. Okay, well, that's fine, but it's a bit pretty and it's a bit predictable. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to adjust our cell length to maybe 1 bar, let's say 2 whole beats, and 1 extra 16th note. Okay, by adjusting the cell length, that's going to also adjust the loop length. Let's hear that. Okay, so it's all sounding a little bit random, but actually I don't mind that because I don't think it's going to take very much for all of this to feel like it's absolutely snapped into place. And before I do the inevitable, which is to put something to just provide this kind of metronomic undertone, what we're going to do is also add to the kind of complexity of these rhythms with effects. So what I mean by that is that on this new retro synth part that I've just programmed for this airy pick sequence, what I'm going to do next is to come to the auto filter. I'm going to open this up, and what we're going to do is to generate some LFO movement. Now again, this is going to be clocked to tempo, but I can choose the rate. So if, let's say, I decided that I wanted this to be a dotted minim, a dotted half note, then effectively the movement of that is going to be undulating up and down at a speed that is different to the actual pattern sequence that's playing it. In other words, like this. Somewhat cheekily, I've also just very quickly added some stereo delay to that sound as well. Now, to demonstrate the point that I'm trying to make, I am now going to give in to temptation and put something underneath this, which is going to provide some rhythmical foundation. Because at that point, we're really going to hear what these variations sound like when we've got extra solidity. So at the moment, our bass line is providing this kind of regular 2-bar thing. Let's go and find a beat loop that's going to do that for us as well. Okay, so let's come back to the beats for a moment. This time, I think I'm going to search for something kick-based, and maybe we'll find something which is just going to provide something... No. No. Definitely not. Can you tell that this isn't rehearsed? What gave it away? Don't love it. No. No. Okay, well, even though I don't love it, we're going to go with it just for a moment, otherwise I'm going to be really wasting your time. We're going to just go with this kind of kick for now. Okay, so what happens when we put in our 2 out of time sequences with our 2 sequences that are absolutely locked to a 2 or 4 bar groove? Okay, what we're going to do next is to go and find another loop, because what I really want to do is to get to a point where we've got a few things all playing at different intervals or speeds. So again, what we'll do is create another new track. This time I'm going to create an audio track. This one is going to also feature another little sort of percussive loop. So again, I think what I might do is to come and find something that's kind of high and interesting. Let's just minimalistic topper. What are you? Okay, this one's going to be better, I think. And this time what I'm going to do is, once again, I'm going to, okay, it turns out that the default cell length is 2 bars exactly. So what I'm going to do is to adjust that. And this time we're going to make it 1 bar and 1 beat and 2 16th notes long. Okay. Now, it's amazing how seductive that kick drum is. And just to show you what I mean, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all of these sequences across to the end, so that effectively we've got all of them waiting to play at that point. And I'm going to remember that my kick drum, which I'm going to move up to the top here, is the sort of last region. I'm going to delete it out of here. We're going to get rid of it there altogether. And what I'm going to do is to also postpone that. And maybe what I'm also going to do is to postpone the bass line. So effectively what we're going to get each time is a bit more than we had before. And what I'm going to do is just effectively have these different grooves available to me to introduce at different times. Take the bass line out of here this time as well. So we kind of go from here. That's really interesting, and we're scratching the surface. I've thrown this together really quickly. We've used loads of loops that have come out of the loop browser, and of course a much more interesting thing to do would be to substitute those parts for drum machine designer kits for other synths that we've curated in much more interesting ways. We could record this session and then add automation that effectively is also just kind of adding to the polyrhythmic nature of where these sequences start and stop. And by the way, just to absolutely bake your brain, what we could also do would be to create a pattern sequence for one of these synthesizers that is using lanes that go backwards and forwards, that skip individual steps, that start and stop not on regular 16th repeats. So effectively the opportunity for this kind of really interesting polyrhythmic thing where every individual part is playing a loop, but all of those loops are of different lengths, I think is really interesting. Effectively, in fact, I'm going to just call it and say that this is part 1 of this technique. And what we're going to do is we're going to dive back into this in much more depth in future as well, because I think that this could be a really interesting way of creating a series of individual cells for loop-based music, which nevertheless get away from all of the problems of the predictability of loop-based music. There, I said it.